Okay, I think we're getting close about that time, Stan, so I'm going to go ahead and start off with a word of prayer and then hand it off to you. Holy Father, a special blessing for all the brethren that could be with us this morning. We ask that you be with us, that you sanctify us, that you give us peace. And as the enemy stirs people up and in opposition to the things that you have established in this world, we ask that you will give us the courage and conviction to do the things that are right and try to correct those things that are wrong. Abide with us now, Lord. Give us peace and serenity. Thank you for giving us another week of life as well. May this day be a day of rest, not just from our labor, but from our worries, from our concerns, from our fears and doubts. Thank you for protecting us and giving us health and giving us all the necessary riches that we require to be able to be faithful and confident in knowing and believing that we have a God that loves us. And so we ask that you will bless our message this morning. May it be your message. May you enlighten us and give us wisdom for our time. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, brother.
Amen. I'll just change my screen. Okay. So the lesson today is attributes of God. Attribute might be a word you're not that familiar with, but it means the same thing as characteristic or quality of something that is inherent within that thing. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is a few of the attributes of God. Now, there are books, entire books that have been written on the topic of exactly what the attributes of God are, and there are lots of them, and you know some of them. Omnipresent, which means that he's everywhere at the same time, and omniscient, that he knows everything. And there are lots more than those. And I'm just going to pick out a few of them here that I think are interesting to us today, and we'll go through those. The first one is going to be his name, and we're going to need to think about that a little bit, because his name is not what a lot of people think of. Mostly when we talk about someone's name, we mean the name that we use to refer to them, like John Doe. So it's the name that we call a person when we're trying to get their attention or when we're trying to talk to them. And that's the Bible does do that, yes, but commonly the Bible uses the word name in a different way. And that's the way that we're going to be focusing on here. It uses it to refer to a character of a person. And that's going to lead us to the character of God here in a minute. And so when we think of a name, we think of something like Joseph or Mary, names from the Bible. But those are really just labels or designations for a person. They're a way to refer to them, as I said before. So there are two different meanings for name, and I'm trying to differentiate them here so you'll know what they are. So one meaning for name refers to the label, you can call it that, of a person, and that we use to refer to a person. And the other one is their character. And we don't usually use the word name that way. We do in certain special circumstances. We use a person's name to refer to a person's character. The Bible does it quite a bit more, but only in particular circumstances, I said, do we do that. And one example that I could think of is in a Western movie, someone might say about someone else, he's made quite a name for himself. Okay, so when we're saying that, they're saying he's made quite a reputation for himself, or he's made quite a character for himself by the thing that he's done. And so in a Western movie, that usually means that he's a dangerous character. He's known for killing people or robbing banks or something similar to that. So a name is commonly used in Westerns as a negative reference to the character of a person. So a person with a bad name is a dangerous person. But a person can also have a good name. And that would be a person who might be quick to help others, or he freely gives his time to make things better for other people, or he does good things whenever he sees an opportunity. So a person can have a good name, meaning a good character, or he can have a bad name, meaning a bad character. And those are the kind of names that we're going to be talking about here, using the word name in that way. And the Bible does that a lot. And it really shouldn't surprise us that the Bible would do that a lot, because, of course, what's important to God is our character and not the label that we wear. He's more interested in the inside of us than how people call us, what name they give us. Although in the Bible, a lot of the names that people have in their label name does reflect their character. And if you look into what the meaning of a lot of the words like Elijah and things like that mean, you'll find that they have a habit of kind of living up to their name, which is to say that the character that's embedded in the meaning of their name is often the character that they have in life. So I hope that makes some sense to people, that there are two different meanings for the word name, the one that we commonly use and the one that refers to a person's character. Okay, so in Exodus, let me just move this up a bit. In Exodus, Moses makes some requests of God, and God responds to those requests by saying that he will do those things, and he says that he will do those things because he knows Moses by name. And so when he says that, he's using the word name, again, as we just talked about, as a reference to a character. So what he says is, I will do this for you, Moses, because I know your character. I know who you are. And that's what's important to God, of course, as we were saying earlier. Our character is what matters to him. Of course, he knows that Moses' name is Moses. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about Moses' character when he says that. And so once God says that, then Moses asks to see God's glory. And God responds with a description of his name, which is part of his glory. And so that's what we're going to look at specifically here. So you can hear my chime clock, unfortunately, in the background. Sorry about that. In that verse where Moses makes that request to see God's glory, that comes from Exodus 33, verse 17 through 20. Now, I took this from the NASB, but I replaced what they have is the Lord with Yahweh, which is what the original translation has. The original translation has the four-letter tetragrammaton that refers to God and is kind of the proper name for God. And so it's NASB with that small change. So Yahweh said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of Yahweh before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. So there's quite a few things that are in that verse, and I'm not going to dig into all of that here. We're really just looking at this idea of what the name of God is, what the character of God is. And so the verse says, or when it says, proclaim the name of Yahweh, that doesn't mean that he's just going to say the name Yahweh. It means that he's going to proclaim the character of Yahweh. He's going to tell us something about what he is, what God is. And so God had previously told Moses his name. And so this verse means that God is about to tell Moses something about his character and what he is. And in fact, God even starts doing that in this verse. Later on, he's going to go into even more of it. But in this verse, he says, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. And so when he says that, that's part of God's character, his name in that sense that we've been talking about here. And so that is part of the nature of God, is what he's saying here is, it is my nature to be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and my nature is to show compassion on whom I will show compassion. And so that's just the nature of God, the character of God. So those statements about his character fit well with his name Yahweh, if you understand a bit about his name Yahweh, and we'll go into that. So if you remember, Moses asked God, back when God was sending him out to the Israelites, he said, who should I say has sent me? And God replies to him with the Hebrew words, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which means I am who I am. Or perhaps it means I will be who I will be. And some people think that it might even be I cause to be what I cause to be. The exact meaning of that isn't precisely known. But those different meanings, all three of those, are probably all correct because they talk about God's character. They talk about his eternality, his permanence, his unchangeability, all of those characteristics of God. So Moses changes that word Eye to Yahweh, which means, instead of I am, it means he is, and says it as Yahweh. And so that's where we pick up the word Yahweh from. So Yahweh, Asher Yahweh, means he is who he is, or he will be who he will be.
Excuse me, Stan, that kind of brings to mind, I don't know if you're going to cover this or not, but that's a term that Israel tried to avoid speaking or saying, which was a term I am. When Moses asked him, whom shall I send me? And he said, tell him the I am, you know.
Yes.
And then when Jesus went about preaching and he said, before Abraham, I am, that, you know, the significance of that to us, it's maybe not the same, but to the Jews, to Israel, that was a big no-no there.
Yeah. When he was saying I am, it isn't just the words I am as we know them. It is I am God is really what it comes to, and without saying the word God. So yes, yeah, when he said things like that, then that got their hackles up. They had a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that is not just a label for God, Yahweh. It is part of his character. It tells us something about him. And so all of these things that we're talking about are part of God's character and what we know of him from what he's told us about his character. So what happens then is God has shown or talked about that he will show himself to Moses, and he's going to hide Moses from it so that Moses won't be killed or anything by it. He says, I'll cover you with my hand, and you won't be able to see my face. If you were to see my face, you would die, because no one can see my face. No man can see my face and live. And so God is about to go and do that and show this stuff to Moses. But even before he's done that, he's told us some things about his character. And that is that idea that I will show mercy on those I chose to show mercy on, and I will show compassion on those who I choose to show compassion on. And so that's just part of God's character. And so moving on with that, so given that his name is I am who I am, it's easy to see his name also including I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. You can kind of see that those two things are similar. I choose what I choose, and I do what I do, and I am what I am. So going back to the verses, a little while after that verse where Moses had requested to see his glory, we come to the section in the next chapter in Exodus 34, verses 6 through 8, where God actually does what he said he was going to do and reveals himself to Moses. And we'll read that. Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Hearing this, Moses made haste to bow low toward the earth and worship. Okay, so in those long words, that whole set of words that God speaks there, those are a name for God. And now we're talking again about long passages being a description of the name of God or the character of God. And there are even people who believe that very long parts of the Old Testament are the name of God. And I've heard some people say that they think that the first 5 books are in fact a very long name for God, if you think of it that way. So a very long description of God's character. So I hope you're understanding this idea that name just doesn't mean a label for somebody, but it talks about their character. Okay, so what God has revealed here is a big chunk of his character. And it's important for us to understand this because it shows the two sides of God's name. And if you go back to the lesson that we had yesterday, you'll remember that there are some people who have a lot of trouble with God being a just God who punishes, and they don't want to see God that way. And we're seeing that in a lot of churches now, is they only ever want to talk about the loving, slow to anger side of God, and they never want to talk about he will punish those who are guilty side of God. So we're going to look at those two sides of God's name because they're both revealed in what God has said here to Moses. The first part of what God said talks about his nature, what he is, his characteristics as God. And he says that he's compassionate and gracious. And he says that he's slow to anger and that he's abounding in loving kindness. We call that mercy or just general niceness, and abounding in truth as well. So those things that God has talked about those are my characteristics. That is what I am, and those things don't change. They are just inherent in me. That's what I am. So that's his own nature. And then as he goes on speaking to Moses there, he talks about how he will treat those who love him. And so the first part of that is he keeps loving kindness for thousands. Okay, so for those people who love him, he loves them back. He treats them with mercy. He does good things for them. And he forgives iniquity for those who love him. He forgives transgression and sin. So again, part of his nature is, for those who love him, is that he will forgive their sins. He will forgive their transgressions. And he will keep loving them and keep treating them well forever. And that's just his nature. He does that, and that doesn't change about him. But on the other side of that is the side that we need to remember as well. And that's how he treats those who do not love him. And he says, I will not by any means leave the guilty unpunished. And we need to understand that about God. And that's a real problem for so many churches today, is that God has both these sides to him, and they need to recognize both sides. And we do. And so he says he won't leave the guilty unpunished. And he says, I will visit the iniquity, the lawbreaking of the fathers onto the children and onto the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. So he's talking to people. The things that you do are going to have an effect on your children and your grandchildren right down to the third and fourth generations. And he says, that's the way I am. I make sure those things happen so that the things that you do wrong have effects down into your family for generations to come. And that's, of course, a warning to people. Don't live like that. If you live like that, the consequences are going to fall on your children and your children's children and so on. Now, Exodus 20, verse 5 has a big part, not all of it, but a big part of that, these words that God has just given to Moses. And in Exodus 25, he uses, instead of saying those who are the guilty, he says those who hate me. And so he's talking about those people who have rejected him, and God sees that as hate. Okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. People can, when we think about hating somebody, it's like I said, we're loathing them. We're always thinking about bad things about them, so forth. But the way he means it there is those that are lawless, those that are disobedient, those that are rebellious against God. He interprets that as hate, and
Yes.
he treats that accordingly.
Yeah. That's very true and important to understand too. You either love God or you hate God. There isn't a middle ground in there. You're not indifferent to God. And so if you aren't in love with him, you are his enemy. You are against him. And he sees it that way, and we need to understand that too. Yeah, good point. Okay, so the name of God is repeated. This name of God that we've just talked about here is repeated in Numbers 14:18. And it's repeated when Moses says these same words back to God as a reminder. At that point, the children of Israel have sinned badly. This is the sin of the golden calf. And the children of Israel, children of God in Israel, have sinned badly. And Moses is convincing God that he shouldn't destroy them and wipe them out. And he says back to God these same words. He says, you are compassionate and gracious. You are slow to anger. You are abounding in loving kindness. That's your nature, God. So please forgive these people who have sinned so badly against you. So this nature of God that we see here, first in this part of Exodus here, is something that's going to be echoed in various places throughout the Bible, because it is part of the nature of God. It's just who he is and what he does. And that is him. Any questions or comments on that part? Okay. Okay, we'll move on to the next part that I want to talk about. This is something that I like a lot. Now, maybe you won't like it so much, but one thing about the characteristic or the nature or attribute of God is his completeness. And we'll start by just saying God is complete. And when we say complete, it means that he lacks nothing. There is nothing that he's missing. He has everything that he needs. He's self-sufficient. His existence does not depend on anything. He's not limited by anything. He doesn't desire anything that he doesn't have within himself. And so God is complete in that sense, that he is completely independent of anything. He isn't bound to the laws of gravity, isn't bound to the laws of nature. All of those things were created by him and didn't exist before him. So he has nothing that he depends on for his existence. He doesn't need food, he doesn't need water, none of those things that we need for our existence. So God is complete in that sense, that he has everything that he needs and requires nothing else.
Is it, but is it fair to say he doesn't need the worship of mankind, but he wants the worship of mankind?
Yes, in fact, we're going to go exactly there. And that's a good point. He doesn't need that worship. It's not something that he required. And we'll talk about that here, because it goes back to creation and why he created mankind. But yeah, you're going exactly where we're going.
Okay.
Okay, so God existed, as I said, before the universe was created, before there was an up and a down, and before there was a left and a right, before any of those things existed, before time existed. When nothing else existed, he existed, and he lacked nothing at all, as we've been saying. He was complete in that. He was happy, self-sufficient, had everything that he needed, and he was not lonely. He wasn't missing people. He wasn't saying, boy, I sure wish I had some people. He wasn't like that. He could have been in that existence forever and chosen never to create anything, and he would have been completely happy without creating anything. So he didn't create people because he had some sort of a need for people. And that, as you can see, that's going to be what you're talking about, Chance. So, so he didn't. So he's the creator of everything that exists, but he didn't need to create it. He didn't have any sort of unrequited desire, some desire hanging out that he always longed for something. He didn't create the universe because he was lacking something that would be in this universe that he created. So here's part of something that people struggle with, and Chance, you've jumped on it right away. He didn't create mankind because he needed something from mankind that mankind could provide to him. He didn't need the companionship or the love of mankind. He didn't need their worship. He didn't need to have people that he could manage. He didn't need to have people that he could be the God over those people. He didn't create mankind for any of those reasons. And like you're saying, he didn't need the worship of mankind, but the Bible does talk about God worshiping man, or sorry, man worshiping God. The people who I formed for myself will declare my praise, says Isaiah. And so he is deserving of our worship, but he doesn't need our worship. We weren't created because he needed that worship. He doesn't have some sort of a need for people to worship him. And so he wasn't unhappy when he didn't have people to worship him. We were created because worshiping him is right and good for us. And sometimes we get those things backwards. We sometimes think that God needs the worship, but in fact, it's us who need to do the worshiping. And so that worshiping is good for us because it puts us in a right state. It puts us in a better state with him and just in general with the whole world. That idea of worshiping God and having God in that place in your life is good for you. So if God did not create the universe and man, or because of mankind and because of any need for mankind, why did he do it? So there may be other reasons, but part of that is simply that he could demonstrate his love and his mercy and his forgiveness and his justice. And we talked about all those things from what he talked to us about before when he was giving Moses those characteristics of him and saying that he was a God who forgives and a God who is always loving and kind. So God created mankind so that he could demonstrate that he has a love and a mercy and a forgiveness and a justice to him, that those are his characteristics. And he demonstrates those by being able to demonstrate them on a people who have rejected him and are hateful of him, as we were talking about earlier. So he had no need for any of those things. Nonetheless, he created mankind so that he could show some of those characteristics that he has. Does that make some sense to everybody? There's a lot of quiet out there. Does that answer your...
I think to me, the significance of that understanding about God, that he doesn't really need anything, it should change the attitude of the believer into thinking, well, if I have time for God, I'll give it to him because, you know, poor guy, he's just waiting on me to do this for him. Or if I have any money left over for for an offering, yeah, I'll give it to him. Maybe he's probably poor. He needs this, you know. It's the attitude is all messed up in a lot of Christians, and they don't understand that he doesn't really need us. We need him. Once you get this attitude out of your head, then you're more about what can I do so that I can have a more fulfilling life, so that I can take advantage of this wonderful relationship that I can have with God. But too many Christians today, I think, got it all wrong. I think that's the significance of this study here, because you need to get this straight in your head, you know, about who really is in charge and who really needs what, you know, because it isn't God at all, and we should feel blessed that he even considers us at all.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's going to be the conclusion of the study, as you've already guessed. And yes, that is so important to understand, and not just about these characteristics, but also other things. A lot of people kind of chafe against God's laws, and they say, well, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to do that. And they don't understand that all of this is for our own benefit, for our own good. It's not something that we do for him, it's something that we do for us. And forgiveness, we've talked about this before many times, in fact, is that the point of forgiveness is to forgive for ourselves. It's good for us to forgive people who do evil things for us, because that lets us put those evil things away and not address them anymore. And so many things are like that, is that the things that God has told us to do are good for us, and they aren't because God somehow needs us to do those things for him. Okay, if there's no more comments. Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at is God's foreknowledge of time. He knows what's going to happen in the future. And I think we all probably know that. But we may not understand exactly what that means in details. And so I'm going to go through some details here that maybe will make you think in a different way than you thought before. And so what does it mean that God knows the future? And I've talked about little bits and pieces of these before in other studies. So some of these are things that you've heard before. So it means that God is never surprised by anything that happens, and he can never regret anything, okay, because he knew it was going to happen. But the Bible does say, in the one place that I can think of, is that God regretted creating mankind. And this comes just as he's about to get Noah to start working on the ark that's going to save 7 people. And God says that he regrets, but we know from that he doesn't, he knew all of this was going to happen. And what he means when he says regret is he's conveying to us, people who do know regret, how he feels about the world having gone in so bad and turned so much against him and his ways. So when he says regret, it's for our benefit to understand how he feels. It isn't that he actually regrets in the way that we would regret something. It also means that God wouldn't have much reason to play board games with anyone. Now, when you think about it, the reason we play board games is that we don't know the future. And so a board game would be boring if you knew what all the dice throws were going to be, or what all the cards were going to be that were going to come up, and what order they were going to come up in. And if you even knew the outcome of the game, who was going to win the game, you wouldn't play the game, because there'd be no point in playing it. You'd know the outcome of the game and the whole sequence of the game before the game even started. So when you think about it, knowing the future has a lot of interesting implications like that, in that some things that you would have done as a person who doesn't know the future would be nothing to you, would be of no interest to you as a person who knows the future. And along with that would be the idea that God would have no reason to play a solitaire game for the same reasons largely that you already know the outcome of the cards or the dice or whatever you're doing for the solitaire game. So when you think of it, a person who knows the future has a very different perspective on life than we do. And that's kind of what we're going to be getting to here is the characteristics of God make him very different from us. And this one with the foreknowledge of time is especially true that way. So it means also that God will not tell people too much about the future. And we've talked about this one quite a bit before. And he can't tell people too much about the future because they may do something that would try to make him a liar, and they may intentionally do that. And so what God can reveal to people about the future depends on who he's talking to and how much he can trust them. So if he has something that he could trust you with, he might reveal it to you. But knowing some things can cause us to do things that we shouldn't do. And so he knows in advance what we can't handle, and he wouldn't tell us those things for that reason. I hope that makes some sense. When you talk about people knowing the future, it's complicated. So God can only provide a limited view of the future to mankind, because if mankind knew too much, they would do wrong things that would fight against what God had revealed to them as being the future. So God is limited by that. Another thing, it means that God must ensure that his prophecies come true. It's not enough to talk about what's going to happen in the future and tell people about that. There are going to be some people who are going to try to fight against that and try to make those prophecies come true. And of course, Satan is one of those people. Satan and his angels are people who would try to make God's prophecies not come true. And so God has to factor in the efforts of his enemies to thwart his prophecies. And so he has to manage the events in the world to make sure that his prophecies do come true. And another thing is, it means that God doesn't need to act at the last minute. And sometimes we often expect God to always be there in the last minute. When the bad thing is about to happen, when the car is skidding on the ice, or when we're doing something, falling down a tree or something like that, we often think of God coming at that time. But God knew these things were coming in advance, and therefore it's possible for him to stop things in advance and make sure that they don't happen to you if that's his choice. And so when you think about that even a little deeper, you can think that when things do happen to you, God has allowed them to happen to you for some reason. So it's all intentional. If bad things come on you, if difficulties come, these are things that God has allowed to happen. And sometimes he's allowed them to happen just so you can know him better. And so because if he does act at the last minute, he's doing that to show you he is acting. But in many cases, God acts before anything has ever happened. And so you never see the accident that didn't happen. You never see the falling down that didn't happen. You never see those things because God acted in advance and the event never happened. So God can act in two ways there. Because he knows the future, he can act in advance to make sure that only the things that he wants happens. But if he wants to reveal himself, he can do a last-minute intervention where he steps in and makes something happen at the last minute so that you can see him acting. Hope that makes some sense to you. As I said, looking at the future and someone who knows the future is complicated. And another part of that is it means that God can be merciful to people who hate him because he knows that someday they will come to love him. And that's kind of an interesting thought too. And that's kind of a page out of my own book, my life. God was merciful to me many times when I was an atheist, but he knew what the outcome was going to be. He knew that I would come to be a strong follower of his, a believer and a teacher even. And so God can do things because he knows the future that he wouldn't necessarily be expected to do to people who don't love him. And he can do those things to prepare people for that future that he has for them when they do turn to him. Any questions about that? That's a hard topic.
Not really, not for me.
I hope that made you understand a little bit about what it means to know the future, and how different a person is who can know the future. And despite the impatience of my cat, I'll continue on. And this is the conclusion that Pastor Joe had already jumped to. So if we try to understand all that God is, that corrects the error that we make by thinking God is like us. And that's something we talked about fairly recently, is the idea that people tend to fall into the habit of thinking that God is just like us. And he's not. We need to really be careful about that. We know from what we've seen here, and obviously, that we don't know the future. And we know that we're dependent on many things for our existence. So right there, we're different from God. He doesn't depend on anything for his existence. And so when we ask ourselves if we are as loving as God, or as forgiving as God, or as just as God, we should find that we are not anywhere near his level. We're just sad shadows of God. And with that understanding in mind, the humility that should come with it, we are able to have the correct relationship to God that we should have. When we understand the greatness of God and how he is not like us, and how we may aspire, in fact should aspire to be like him, we are not like him. Any questions?